Incentives. Many countries have sought to improve their economy by introducing varieties of tax incentives for investment, for savings, for export, for employment, for regional development, and so on. Often, such incentives are redundant and ineffective, giving up revenue and complicating the fiscal system without achieving their stated objective. Even to the extent that they would have done in the response to market signals. The result is often distorting and inefficient, diverting scarce resources into less than optimal uses. Essentially, tax incentives improve economic performance only if government officials are better able to decide the best type and the means of production than are private investors. Tax incentives also result in very uneven tax burden, with domestic companies often subject to full taxation, at least in theory, while other firms, often foreign investors, will benefit from tax incentives that reduce their effective tax rates. Despite such structure, many developing and in transitional countries continue to introduce and extend a variety of special tax incentives, partly in competition with one another for increased foreign direct investment (FDI). Experience suggests, however, that non-tax factors such as sound macroeconomic policy, good infrastructure, and a sustainable governance system are more important factors in location decision than tax benefit. Although a limited role for certain simple incentives may exist as part of a growth-oriented fiscal policy, as some East Asian experience suggests, tax incentive cannot compensate for the absence of such critical factors. Should a country decide to introduce a few limited incentives, these tax incentives should be well designed, properly implemented, and periodically evaluated if they are to do more good than harm. The failure to develop a good tax administration and a good tax policy together has been a particular problem in some transitional countries such as Nigeria. Even if policies are good, the way in which they are administered can yield very different outcomes than those intended. Administration that is seen as unfair and capricious may bring the whole taxation system as a whole into disrupt. The initial failure of transitional countries to develop their tax administration when introducing new tax structure result in very uneven tax imposition, lower than anticipated revenue, and widespread tax evasion. Similarly, in some developing countries, corporate tax liabilities are often negotiated rather than calculated as set out in the law. Bribery is sometimes considered a regular part of compensation of tax officials. Such corruption undermines confidence in the tax system, negatively affects willingness to pay taxes, and reduces a country's capacity to finance government expenditure. The argument is that improved tax administration alone can generate the revenues required to balance the budget or to finance tax policy change that will narrow the tax base through concession or low tax rate. Although better tax administration will generally enhance tax collection. Taxation is a legislative business, and as such, a closer oversight is hereby demanded from our legislators. Legislative business, and as such, a closer oversight is thereby demanded from our legislatures. In Russia, for example, serious problem existed with both the structure of the VAT and the lack of administrative experience and capacity. A simple example is that under the initial VAT legislation, no tax liability was due when loans were made from one business to another. Thus, a buyer would claim to have made a loan that was never repaid and was in fact payment for goods to a supplier and no tax was due. The result was a significant loss of revenue. A more capable administration would have followed these simple evasion techniques, but better legislation was also needed. Another observation was the case of Gambia. Mining companies uses transfer pricing to evade tax. For example, a low price rate were normally declared by the multinationals while a high rate is being obtained in the buyer countries. On that note, the Gambian government made a bold step in 2013 by launching a frantic legislative action on multinationals that boosted their economy in no small measure. Again, in 2011 to 2012, the Colombian government equally took a bold step on tax legislation, and the result was that they made 75% increase in their tax revenue to GDP within a short period of 10 months. Another good reference or observation was the countries that are doing well in the taxation system, such as Malawi, Kenya, and Lesotho. These countries has 25% to 30% tax ratio to GDP, yet they still deem it necessary to establish an independent agency for the general oversight of their tax administration. Global methodology of taxation. Countries no longer have the luxury to design their tax system in isolation. Commentators use the term of globalization to mean anything from an increase in mobility of business input, primarily capital across regions, to change in consumption and the production pattern so that national borders have reduced its vacancies. The result is a loss of tax sovereignty by individual countries. In that regard, a country with a tax system that differs substantially from other countries, particularly its neighboring countries, will suffer benefit. In addition, with increased financial innovation, labels are losing their meanings. Lawyers and investment bankers can with relative ease convert equity to debt, business profit to royalty, leases to sales, and ordinary income to capital gain, or the other way around. Therefore, initiatives such as tax incentives, VAT, personal income, and the corporate income taxes needed more sophisticated tax administration, unlike the custom duty that simply required a few control points at the border or the seaport. Another good thing about globalization, but has a negative impact on any country that failed to innovate, is the Electronic Service Delivery (ESD). World Trade Organization (WTO) and Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development (OECD) membership requires reduction in import and export taxes. This has different consequences in different parts of the world. Trade taxes in OECD countries account for about 2.3% for the total revenue. In contrast, trade taxes in low-income African countries like Nigeria often account for 25 to 30% of tax revenue. Such countries have less capacity to make up lost revenue by increasing other taxes such as VAT. Another observation is that there will be pressure on VAT revenue. Much have been written about the challenges posed by the electronic commerce on the income tax and VAT base, as quoted by tax analyst Mr. Bird in 2005. that improvement in technology allows increase of sales without the seller having a physical presence in the country, as well as increased use of digitalized products that make collecting taxes on such products more difficult. An innovation to meet the world standard of taxation is highly needed. In these and other ways, the internal problem of designing and implementing a good tax system continue to be complicated by the changing world within which such decisions must be made because the risk of not innovating outweighs the risk of innovation. As I want to use the opportunity to remind you that Nigeria as a nation copied the administration system of tax of two countries, the United Kingdom and the United States of America. But in taxation, we never did. I want to remind you that our IGR is just about 6% of our GDP, which is the lowest in the world. The United States tax analyst said, and I quote, that there are two things that are sure in life, that is debt and tax payment. I want to also remind you that the United States in the year 1862 copied the United Kingdom method of taxation when the today's IRS was formally initiated after the United States Civil War. Though it have metamorphosed to several names, innovations, and reforms, I want to use the opportunity to remind you that the greater percentage of Nigerians are mistaking you are lawmakers, that you are elected to the National Assembly so as to get your own share and the share of your constituency, of which is wrong. But even if their perception is right, will there be anything to share if the federal government purse is empty? Which I know the answer is no. In that regard, the first priority of lawmakers and their counterparts in other nations of the world is to fashion the best initiatives and reforms that will boost the economy of their nations, our countries. They need to establish National Inspector General for Tax Crime Commission. The establishment of National Inspector General for Tax Crime Commission is important so as to join the world global best practice of taxation. Also, to promote efficiency, effectiveness, and transparency in the Federal Land Revenue Service programs and operations, and equally restore taxpayers' confidence and their compliance in paying their taxes. Mr. Magnetti, a tax analyst in 2003 International Economic Conference, said, and I quote, "In 20th century stemmed from the need to have an independent supervisory institution that will serve as a pillar for the defense of the common man, mostly the deprived, Magnetti, a tax analyst in 2003 International Economic Conference, said, and I quote, "In 20th century stemmed from the need to have an independent supervisory institution that will serve as a pillar for the defense of the common man, mostly the deprived lost of the society, against violation of rights, administration excesses, abuse of power, illegal act, denial of justice, discrimination, unfairness, and maladministration." Such mechanism to regulate the administrative excesses in both the public and private sector would instill accountability and transparency. Thereby create trust, confidence, and certainty. Mr. Magnetti submitted that the accountability concepts are judged from the fact that many countries in the world should have an independent agency as an institution for checks and balance in their taxation programs and operations, e.g., the TICTA of the United States, the HTTC of the United Kingdom, and the IGTA of Australia. Meanwhile, more than 25 African countries have already structured their taxation system to suit the best global practice. It is the duty of our MPs to defend and protect the right of the citizenry as submitted by Mr. Gota and Mrs. Ostina, that it is neither the Constitution and the legislation nor proclamation and declaration that protect human rights. Rather, human right protection is achieved through the availability of remedy. Again, this view was shared by Mr. Desinas in 2009 Economic Conference. He emphasized that the Constitution and the rule of law is not what makes the difference. Instead, what makes the difference is the ability of the state to transform the principle and right enshrined in the law, in the Constitution, into practice, so as to guarantee the right and liberty of the state. It is therefore important to note that the establishment of a regulatory agency like NIGTCC will function to safeguard the rights and remedy and liberty of the taxpayers. It cannot be overemphasized the importance of the establishment of National Inspector General for Tax Crime Commission. First is that it is already the modern global structural method of taxation. Secondly, another major task is keeping the tax administration honest. No government can expect the taxpayer to comply willingly if the taxpayer believes that the tax structure is unfair or that revenue collected is not effectively used. The perception of the taxpayers is pivotal in taxpayer behavior towards self-compliance. The method tax obligations are forced on taxpayers can have a negative impact in tax revenue generation. Meanwhile, the taxpayers may become discouraged, disillusioned, and they will become disobedient because of lack of interpretation of the tax obligation enforced on them. Meanwhile, our method of taxation is capable of corrupting any person appointed to head the Federal Revenue Service because of the obvious temptation in our system of taxation. Furthermore, if we start today, it is still early. It is better to be late than never. I want to tell you that Nigeria stands a chance to assist other African countries if they can take our taxation seriously. I am convinced that with the great men and women of these hallowed chambers who have held different types of offices and high positions, even former state governors that are among you here, that this country is the greatest in the whole black race, and I want to assure you that we lack nothing by the grace of God. I equally want to use this opportunity to tell you, our leaders, that if the National Inspector General for Tax Crime Commission is created, that it will not be a burden to the federal government recurrent expenditure. I also want to assure you that this agency, after its enactment, will not only create jobs, but will also double whatever the Federal Revenue Service is currently generating. Distinguished senators and honorable members, I plead that you explore the trust the Nigerian populace bestowed in you to fast-track this bill without delay, because even the federal government of Nigeria, FGN, recent approval of Nigerian Labour Congress NLC demand on the increment of wages is not sustainable without a proper, structured, responsive and proactive tax administration. The federal government is not even sure of where to get this money from. Meanwhile, the increment of VAT they are talking about is not the answer, because the more you increase taxes, the more you encourage distortion, tax avoidance and tax evasion. There must be a total restructuring and reforming of the method the Federal Inland Revenue Service does its business. Remember that an adage said that a little snake seen by one person could be said to be a python. Distinguished senators and honorable members, thank you for your time taken and your patience to listen to this explanatory memorandum of an act to establish National Inspector General for Tax Crime Commission. Thank you once again, and God bless you. God bless the Federal Republic of Nigeria. Sincerely, Orji Philip Orji, National Coordinator, Association of Concerned Citizens of Nigeria on Revenue and Economy.